repeal of Chapter 7.150 of the Fullerton Municipal Code. This from our city attorney.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Jim Touchstone from my office is here to make a presentation. This is in response to California Supreme Court decision in the area involving San Diego County in Ray Taylor, and a response to a lawsuit filed by Mr. Frank Lindsay against the city of Fullerton regarding our current existing ordinance. Mr. Touchstone.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm here recommending the repeal of the ordinance, and as my partner indicated, there are essentially two reasons for that. The first one is the California Supreme Court decision of N. Ray Taylor. It's handed down in 2015, wherein the court examined a very similar blanket residency restriction as is set forth in our current ordinance 7.150.030. And specifically, the court there found that that provision was unconstitutional, applied in an overarching fashion. And that was based on the substantive due process clause of the 14th Amendment, and it struck that provision down. The court did, however, say that parole officers could interpose specific restrictions as to specific registrants if the individualized facts and circumstances supported that type of a parole provision. And then secondarily, we're facing a lawsuit right now, the city is, that was filed by Mr. Frank Lindsay in September of 2016. I immediately reached out to opposing counsel to negotiate a stay of those proceedings so that the city was not incurring defense cost of that lawsuit, so that we could have time to get this in front of you for your consideration here tonight. And specifically, I've also negotiated a contingent settlement. That settlement is contingent upon repeal of this ordinance, as well as $5,000 of payment to a nonprofit entity, the Family Safety Foundation. So in other words, there would be actually no money going to the registrant plaintiff in this case, nor any money going to his attorney. I will say also for the record that there have been 18 lawsuits filed by the same plaintiff. 3 of those are in Orange County. That includes the city of Fullerton, of course, city of Touchstone, the city of Seal Beach. Touchstone repealed its ordinances and paid some attorney's fees. Seal Beach just got served recently. They haven't not yet responded. All the other cities outside of Orange County have also resolved the case by way of repeal of their ordinances and payment of a nominal amount of attorney's fees, either to the nonprofit that I mentioned to you and or to the attorney. One city has fought it. That's the city of Murrieta. Ironically, they are on for consideration tonight in front of their council. They fought it and lost. A preliminary injunction was entered by the district court against the city of Murrieta for enforcement of the ordinance, essentially finding that there was a likelihood that the plaintiff would prevail, that their ordinance, which is very similar to ours, is unconstitutional on its face. And as a result of that, their settlement that they're discussing tonight is repeal of their ordinance and payment of $90,000 in attorney's fees for their unsuccessful defense of the case. Candidly, I will tell you that based upon the legal authority out there, it is unlikely that we would prevail in this lawsuit. I suspect that we would be in the same shoes that the city of Murrieta is in if we were to proceed with attempting to fight it. With that being said, I'm happy to answer any questions that the council may have.
Any questions for Mr. Touchstone from the council? Mr.
If this, by the way, there's a typo in here. It says City Attorney's Office recommends appeal. I think you mean repeal?
Repeal, that's correct,
okay.
Mayor.
There's a typo in that.
My apologies for that.
If the ordinance is repealed, what happens to the case? Is that dismissed? Is there any agreement to that?
That is correct. The case would be dismissed with prejudice. We'd be done with the lawsuit entirely.
Thank you.
And again, just by way of background, the council was well-intentioned in this process, was addressing community concern, the council concern. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has determined that the language that was contained in our proposed ordinance doesn't meet constitutional standards, and therefore our recommendation is to repeal it. Not that it wasn't a good idea in the beginning, but rather that it's later been determined by courts that the language we used was not enforceable.
That's absolutely correct. We've faced a similar legal challenge previously regarding our parks residents or parks restriction as far as registrants not being able to go into the parks. There was a Court of Appeal decision which ruled that that was preempted by state law. So we repealed that portion of this ordinance in 2014, as you may recall, those of you who were sitting on the council at the time, and this is the next stage of that legal challenge. At that time in 2014, the council chose not to repeal the entire ordinance because you wanted to do what you could to ensure that the city here is safe, of course. I will tell you that despite the fact of whether or not the council votes to repeal this ordinance, all state law provisions concerning registrants are still in place, the enforcement provisions, parole conditions, and so forth that are being set forth as to individuals. So in other words, the members of the police department have a significant number of tools to ensure that registrants are following the rules of parole and conditions of parole that are imposed upon them, as well as any other enforcement provisions that they may need to do their jobs. Finally, one final comment along those same lines. The Supreme Court, in issuing the In re Taylor decision, relied in part upon a California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation task force study, which in fact indicated that, and this is law enforcement, in other words, CDCR personnel who did this study, which indicated that these residency restrictions in fact hampered public safety because it encouraged homelessness. It made it more difficult to track registrants because they had no static address. It also made it more difficult for them to get to services to prevent recidivism. So the reason I bring that out is I know that there are probably some concerns amongst the council and or audience members that by repealing this ordinance we are somehow undermining public safety in the city. I will tell you that the evidence is to the contrary from the studies that have been completed by law enforcement personnel themselves. So that's all I have, unless you have any additional questions based on my final
No, I
comments.
appreciate that about unintended consequences there, but if there are no further questions from council, we would open this item up for public comment.
Thank you.
We're good? Yes, thanks. Any members of the public wishing to speak to this item, please come forward.